Hello friends, welcome to Medically. In this video, we are going to discuss the chapter 17th of 11th NCERT Biology, Breathing and Exchange of Gases. In this video, we will read the chapter and we discuss the important point regarding the NEET exam. So without further delay, let us start the chapter. As we have read earlier, oxygen O2 is utilized by the organism to indirectly break down simple molecules like glucose, amino acid, fatty acid, etc. to derive energy to perform various activities. Carbon dioxide, which is harmful, is also released during the above catabolic reaction. It is therefore evident that oxygen has to be continuously provided to the cells and CO2 produced by the cells have to be released out. This process of exchange of oxygen from the atmosphere with CO2 produced by the cells is called breathing, commonly known as respiration. Place your hand on your chest. You can feel the chest moving up and down. You know that it is due to breathing. How do we breathe? The respiratory organs and the mechanism of breathing are described in the following sections. Respiratory organs. Mechanism of breathing vary among the different groups of animals, depending mainly on their habitat and level of organization. Lower invertebrate like sponges, coelenterate, flatworm, etc. exchange oxygen with CO2 by simple diffusion over their entire body surface. Earthworms use their mast cuticle, and insects have a network of tracheal tubes to transport atmospheric air within the body. Special vascularized structure called gills, branchial respiration, are used by most of the aquatic arthropods and molluscs, whereas vascularized bag called lungs, pulmonary respiration, are used by the terrestrial forms for the exchange of gases. Among vertebrates, fishes use gills, whereas amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals respire through lungs. Amphibians like frog can respire through their moist skin. Cutaneous respiration is present. Let us see the human respiratory system. We have a pair of external nostrils opening out above the upper lips. It leads to the nasal chamber through the nasal passage. The nasal chamber opens into the pharynx, which is the common opening for both esophagus for food opening and nasal opening. A portion which is common passage for food and air. The pharynx opens through the larynx region into the trachea. You have to remember the sequence. First the nostrils, then nostrils open into pharynx, then larynx, and then into trachea. Larynx is a cartilaginous box which helps in sound production and is called the sound box. During swallowing, glottis can be covered by a thin elastic cartilaginous flap called epiglottis to prevent the entry of food into the larynx. Trachea is a straight tube extending up to the mid-thoracic cavity which divides at the level of fifth thoracic vertebra into right and left primary bronchi. Each bronchi undergo repeated division to form the secondary and tertiary bronchi and bronchioles, ending up in very thin terminal bronchioles. The trachea, primary, secondary, and tertiary bronchi and initial bronchioles are supported by incomplete cartilaginous rings. Each terminal bronchioles gives rise to a number of very thin, irregular walled and vascularized bag-like structure called alveoli. The branching network of bronchi, bronchioles, and alveoli comprises the lungs. Figure 17.1. We have two lungs which are covered by a double-layered pleura with pleural fluid between them. So the lung layer is called as pleura and the fluid is pleural fluid. It reduces the friction on the lung surface. The outer pleural membrane is in close contact with the thoracic lining, whereas the inner pleural membrane is in contact with the lung surface. The part starting with the external nostril up to the terminal bronchioles constitute the conducting part, whereas the alveoli and their ducts form the respiratory or exchange part of the respiratory system. The conducting part transports the atmospheric air to the alveoli, clear it from foreign particles, humidifies and also bring the air to body temperature. Exchange part is the site of actual diffusion of oxygen and CO2 between blood and atmospheric air. The lungs are situated in the thoracic chamber, which is anatomically an airtight chamber. The thoracic chamber is formed dorsally by the vertebral column, ventrally by the sternum, laterally by the ribs, on the lower side by the dome-shaped diaphragm. The anatomical setup of the lung in thorax is such that any change in the volume of the thorax cavity will be reflected in the lung pulmonary cavity. Such an arrangement is essential for breathing, as we cannot directly alter the pulmonary volume. Respiration involves the following steps. First is breathing or pulmonary ventilation, by which atmospheric air is drawn in and CO2 rich alveolar air is released out. Diffusion of gases O2 and CO2 across alveolar membrane. Third is transport of gases by the blood. Fourth, diffusion of O2 and CO2 between the blood and tissue. And last is utilization of O2 by the cells for catabolic reaction and resultant release of CO2, cellular respiration, as dealt in chapter 14. Let us see the figure. Diagrammatic view of human respiratory system. Sectional view of the left lung is also shown. Here they have represented the epiglottis, larynx, trachea, larynx open into trachea. Then here they have given the bronchus, heart in between the two lungs, side down, what is diaphragm, sides are enclosed by ribs, cut ends of ribs, pleural membrane, alveoli, terminal part, pleural fluid, bronchioles. Line. Let us see the mechanism of breathing. Breathing involves two stages, inspiration, during which atmospheric air is drawn in, and expiration, by which the alveolar air is released out. The movement of air into and out of the lung is carried out by creating a pressure gradient between the lung and the atmosphere. Inspiration can occur if the pressure within the lung, that is intrapulmonary pressure, is less than the atmospheric pressure. That is, there is a negative pressure in the lungs with respect to atmospheric pressure. This point you have to remember, that inspiration occurs when the intrapulmonary pressure inside the lung, the pressure is low as compared to the atmosphere. Then the outside air comes inside, and it's called inspiration. Similarly, expiration takes place when the intrapulmonary pressure is higher than the atmospheric pressure. The diaphragm and a specialized set of muscles, external and internal intercostal between the ribs, helps in generation of such gradient. Internal and external intercostal muscle helps in generation of the pressure and the gradient. Inspiration is initiated by the contraction of diaphragm, which increases the volume of thoracic chamber in the anterior-posterior axis. The contraction of external intercostal muscle lifts up the ribs and the sternum, causing an increase in the volume of the thoracic chamber in the dorsoventral axis. The overall increase in the thoracic volume causes a similar increase in pulmonary volume. An increase in pulmonary volume decreases the intrapulmonary pressure to less than the atmospheric pressure, which forces the air from outside to move into the lung. As the volume inside the lungs increases, it decreases the intrapulmonary pressure than the atmospheric pressure, so that it forces the air from the outside to move into the lungs. That is inspiration. Relaxation of the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles return the diaphragm and sternum to their normal position and reduces the thoracic volume and thereby pulmonary volume. This leads to an increase intrapulmonary pressure to slightly above the atmospheric pressure, causing the explosion of air from the lungs, that is expiration. Figure 17.2b represents this. We have the ability to increase the strength of inspiration and expiration with the help of the additional muscles in the abdomen. On an average, a healthy human breathes 12 to 16 times per minute. This number you have to remember, that a healthy human can breathe 12 to 16 times per minute. The volume of air involved in breathing movements can be estimated by using a spirometer. So, for measuring the volume of breathing, the spirometer is used, which helps in clinical assessment of pulmonary function. Let us see the diagrams. Mechanism of breathing showing first is inspiration and second is expiration. Air entering into lung. Due to decrease in intrapulmonary pressure than the atmosphere, the air outside the atmosphere enter into the lung and increase the volume of the thorax increased, and due to this ribs and sternum are raised, diaphragm is contracted. The opposite case is seen in expiration. Air is expelled from the lungs. In this case, the intrapulmonary pressure is more than the atmospheric pressure, so that the air inside the lung go outside to the atmosphere and the volume of the thorax is decreased. Diaphragm is relaxed or arched upward. Ribs and sternum return to their original position. Let us see the respiratory volumes and capacities. TV, that is tidal volume. Volume of air inspired or expired during a normal respiration. It is approximately 500 ml. That is, a healthy man can inspire or expire approximately 6000 to 8000 ml of air per minute. Inspiratory reserve volume, additional volume of air a person can inspire by forcible inspiration. This average 2500 ml to 3000 ml. You have to remember the ml in tidal volume, in inspiratory reserve volume. In tidal volume it is 500 ml, while in inspiratory reserve volume it is 2500 to 3000 ml. In expiratory reserve volume, additional volume of air a person can expire by forceful expiration. This is average 1000 ml to 1100 ml. Residual volume, the volume of air remaining in the lung even after forceful expiration. This average 1100 ml to 1200 ml. By adding up a few respiratory volume described above, one can derive various pulmonary capacities which can be used in clinical diagnosis. Inspiratory capacity, IC. Total volume of air a person can inspire after a normal expiration. This includes TV plus inspiratory reserve volume. Expiratory capacity. Total volume of air a person can expire after a normal inspiration. This includes TV plus ERV. Functional residual capacity. Volume of air that will remain in the lung after a normal expiration. Normal expiration च्या नंतर जी व्हॉल्यूम लंग मध्ये शिल्लक राहते तिला म्हणतात फंक्शनल रेसिड्युअल कॅपॅसिटी FRC. आणि यामध्ये ERV प्लस RV असतात. Let us see the vital capacity VC. The maximum volume of air a person can breathe in after a forced expiration. This includes ERV, TV and IRV. Or the maximum volume of air a person can breathe out after a forced inspiration. This includes ERV plus IRV plus TV. Total lung capacity TLC, total volume of air accommodated in the lung at the end of a forced inspiration. This includes RV, ERV, TV, and IRV, or vital capacity plus RV, residual volume. Let us see the exchange of gases. Alveoli are the primary sites of exchange of gases. Exchange of gases also occur between blood and tissue. Oxygen and CO2 are exchanged in this site by simple diffusion, mainly based on pressure concentration gradient. Solubility of the gases as well as the thickness of the membrane involved in the diffusion are also some important factors that can affect the rate of diffusion. Pressure contributed by an individual gas in a mixture of gases is called a partial pressure and is represented as PO2 for oxygen and PCO2 for carbon dioxide. Partial pressure of these two gases in the atmospheric air and the two sites of diffusion are given in table 17.1. And in figure 17.3, the data given in the table clearly indicate a concentration gradient for oxygen from alveoli to blood and blood to tissue. Similarly, a gradient is present for CO2 in the opposite direction, that is from tissue to blood and blood to alveoli. As the solubility of CO2 is 20 to 25 times higher than that of O2, the amount of CO2 that can be diffused through the diffusion membrane per unit difference in partial pressure is much higher compared to that of O2. The diffusion membrane is made up of three major layers, figure 17.4. Here they are remaining the diffusion membrane's three layers. Diagram of a section of an alveolus with a pulmonary capillary. Air enter into alveolar cavity. Here is the basement membrane and then endothelium of blood capillary, red blood cells, squamous epithelium of alveolar wall, one-celled thick. These are the layers. Let us see the partial pressure in mmHg of oxygen and carbon dioxide at different parts involved in diffusion in comparison to those in atmosphere. Respiratory gas O2. Atmospheric air contain 159, alveoli contain 104, blood deoxygenated blood contain 40, and blood oxygenated contain 95, and tissue contain 40. Partial pressure. For CO2, atmospheric air is 0.3, alveoli 40, deoxygenated blood is 45, oxygenated blood is 40, and tissue is 45. Let us see the diagrammatic representation of exchange of gases at the alveolus and the body tissue with blood and transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Here is the inspired air and expired air. Alveolar air. Partial pressure of O2 is 104 mm of Hg, while that for CO2 it is 40 mm of Hg. So, from body tissue, CO2 is lead into the systematic vein and oxygen from the systematic artery enter into the body tissue. The CO2 is carried out by systematic veins to the pulmonary artery before entering into atria and ventricle. Through aorta it enters into pulmonary artery, and here then exchange takes place with alveolus and oxygen enter into pulmonary vein, then systematic artery, then again into the body tissues. You have to remember the sequence. The diffusion membrane is made up of three major layers, namely the thin squamous epithelial of alveoli, the endothelium of alveolar capillaries, and the basement substance composed of a thin basement membrane supporting the squamous epithelium and the basement membrane surrounding the single layer endothelial cells of capillaries in between them. However, its total thickness is much less than a millimeter. Therefore, all the factors in our body are favorable for diffusion of O2 from alveoli to tissue and that of CO2 from tissue to alveoli. Let us see the transport of gases. Blood is the medium of transport for O2 and CO2. About 97% of O2 is transported by RBCs in the blood. The remaining 3% of O2 is in dissolved state through the plasma. Nearly 20 to 25% of CO2 is transported by RBCs, whereas 70% of it is carried as bicarbonate. About 7% of CO2 is carried in a dissolved state through plasma. So, maximum O2 is transported by RBCs, while maximum CO2, that is 70% of CO2, is carried in the form of bicarbonate. Transport of oxygen. Hemoglobin is a red-colored iron-containing pigment present in the RBCs. Oxygen can bind with hemoglobin in a reversible manner to form oxyhemoglobin. Each hemoglobin molecule can carry a maximum of 4 molecules of O2. Binding of oxygen with hemoglobin is primarily related to partial pressure of O2, partial pressure of CO2, hydrogen ion concentration, and temperature are the other factors which can interfere with this binding. A sigmoid curve is obtained when percentage saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen is plotted against the pCO2. The curve is called the oxygen dissociation curve and is highly useful in studying the effect of factors like pCO2, H plus concentration, etc. on binding of oxygen with hemoglobin in the alveoli where there is high PO2, low pCO2, lesser H plus concentration, and lower temperature. The factors are all favorable for the formation of oxyhemoglobin. Here is only high amount of pCO2 and other things are low. Then it is favorable for formation of oxyhemoglobin. Whereas in the tissue where the low PO2, high pCO2, high H plus concentration and high temperature opposite to the formation of oxyhemoglobin. It is favorable for dissociation of oxygen from the oxyhemoglobin. This clearly indicates that oxygen gets bound to hemoglobin in the lung surface and get dissociated at the tissue. Every 100 ml of oxygenated blood can deliver around 5 ml of oxygen to the tissue under normal physiological conditions. Let us see the oxygen dissociation curve. Here is the sigmoid curve obtained. On x-axis they plotted the partial pressure of oxygen in mm of Hg, while on y-axis it is plotted the percentage saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen. Let us see the transport of carbon dioxide. CO2 is carried by hemoglobin as carb-aminohemoglobin, about 20 to 25%. This binding is related to the partial pressure of CO2, PO2. PO2 is a major factor which could affect this binding. When pCO2 is high and PO2 is low, as in the tissue, more binding of carbon dioxide occur, whereas when the pCO2 is low and PO2 is high, as in alveoli, dissociation of CO2 from carb-aminohemoglobin takes place. That is, CO2 which is bound to hemoglobin from the tissue is delivered at the alveoli. RBCs contain a very high concentration of the enzyme carbonic anhydrase and minute quantities of the same is present in the plasma too. This enzyme facilitates the following reaction in both directions. CO2 plus O2 in the presence of carbonic anhydrase give H2CO3 and also in presence of carbonic anhydrase they form HCO3 minus ion plus H plus ion. These two reactions are reversible reactions. At the tissue site where partial pressure of CO2 is high due to catabolism, CO2 diffuses into the blood, RBCs and plasma. and forms HCO3- and H+. At the alveolar site, where PCO2 is low, the reaction proceeds in the opposite direction, leading to the formation of CO2 and water. The CO2 trapped as a bicarbonate at the tissue level and transported to the alveoli is released out as CO2. Figure 17.4 represents every 100 ml of deoxygenated blood delivers approximately 4 ml of CO2 to the alveoli. Let us see the regulation of respiration. Human beings have a significant ability to maintain and moderate the respiratory rhythm to suit the demand of the body tissue. This is done by the neural system, a specialized center present in the medulla region of the brain called the Respiratory Rhythm Center is primarily responsible for this regulation. Another center present in the pons region of the brain called a pneumatic center can moderate the function of the respiratory rhythm center. Neural signals from the center can reduce the duration of inspiration and thereby alter the respiratory rate. A chemosensitive area is situated adjacent to the rhythm center, which is highly sensitive to CO2 and hydrogen ions. Increase in this substance can activate these centers, which in turn can signal the rhythm center to make necessary adjustment in the respiratory processes by which this substance can be eliminated. Receptors associated with aortic arch and carotid artery also can recognize changes in CO2 and H+ concentration and sends necessary signals to the rhythm center for remedial actions. The role of oxygen in the regulation of respiratory rhythm is quite insignificant. Let us see the disorders of respiratory system. Asthma is a difficulty in breathing and causing wheezing due to inflammation of bronchi and bronchioles. Here, asthma occurs due to inflammation of bronchi and bronchioles. Emphysema is a chronic disorder in which alveolar walls are damaged due to which respiratory surface is decreased. One of the major causes of this is cigarette smoking. Let us see the occupational respiratory disorders. In certain industries, especially those involving grinding or stone breaking, so much dust is produced that the defense mechanism of the body cannot fully cope with the situation. Long exposure can give rise to inflammation, leading to fibrosis, proliferation of fibrous tissue, and thus causing serious lung damage. Workers in such industries should wear protective masks. Let us see the last part of this chapter summary. Cells utilize oxygen for metabolism and produce energy along with substances like carbon dioxide, which is harmful. Animals have evolved different mechanisms for the transport of oxygen to the cells and for the removal of carbon dioxide from there. We have a well-developed respiratory system comprising two lungs and associated air passage to perform this function. The first step in respiration is breathing, by which atmospheric air is taken in, inspiration, and the alveolar air is released out, expiration. Exchange of O2 and CO2 between deoxygenated blood and alveoli. Transport of these gases throughout the body by blood. Exchange of O2 and CO2 between the oxygenated blood and tissue. And utilization of oxygen by the cells, cellular respiration, are the other steps involved. Inspiration and expiration are carried out by creating pressure gradient between the atmosphere and alveoli with the help of specialized muscle, intercostal and diaphragm. Volume of air involved in these activities can be estimated with the help of spirometer and are of clinical significance. Exchange of O2 and CO2 at the alveoli and the tissue occur by diffusion. Rate of diffusion is depend on the partial pressure gradient of oxygen PO2 and CO2 PCO2, their solubility as well as the thickness of the diffusion surface. These factors in our body facilitate diffusion of O2 from the alveoli to the deoxygenated blood as well as from the oxygenated blood to the tissue. The factors are favorable for the diffusion of CO2 in the opposite direction, that is from tissue to alveoli. Oxygen is transported mainly as oxyhemoglobin. In the alveoli, where PO2 is higher and O2 get bound to hemoglobin, which is easily dissociated at the tissue, whereas PO2 is low and PCO2 and H plus concentration are high. Nearly 70% of the carbon dioxide is transported as bicarbonate H3O minus with the help of enzyme carbonic anhydrase. 20 to 25% of the carbon dioxide is carried by hemoglobin as carbaminohemoglobin. In the tissue where PCO2 is high, it gets bound to the blood, and whereas in the alveoli where PCO2 is low and PO2 is high, it gets removed from the blood. Respiratory rhythm is maintained by the respiratory center in the medulla region of the brain. A pneumatic center in the pons region of the brain and a chemosensitive area in the medulla can alter the respiratory mechanism. In this way, we completed this chapter. If you liked the video, then don't forget to subscribe the channel Medical Duo. Thank you.